Okay. Some of you maybe know me as a medievalist because, well, that's true. Most of the time I'm working with medieval art. But as it was said, another field of my research, second field of my research, is non-European art and also German ethnology. So, um, although this paper will mainly deal with the exhibition we are currently working on with my colleague, Dr. Urszula Bończuk-Dawidziuk, and to which I hope we will able to invite you in May 2025, I would like to begin with the history of the Anthropological and Ethnographic Museum in Wrocław, or I should say Breslau, an institution that today seems a little bit forgotten. This will highlight some of the problems and issues we have to deal with in our work. So, good. The history of the museum began when Georg Tilenius took up the position of Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Breslau in 1900. And this happened thanks to anatomy professor Karl Hasse. It is also at this point that the creation of anthropological and ethnographic collection began. Initially, both of them were kept together with the anatomical collection at the medical faculty of the University of Breslau. At this stage, the collection consisted of objects that Tilenius had donated himself from his private collection, as well as those purchased and donated, such as the donation of more than 280 objects from the South Seas and so-called Sammlung Mende. It was Tilenius who was the first to organize this collection, which were then stored in 2 rooms of the St. Joseph's Convent in Breslau. Funding problems, however, caused Tilenius to resign his tenure in 1904 and accept a job offer as a director of the Ethnographic Museum in Hamburg, creating there one of the most important institutions of this kind in Europe, as I think. Now it's the Mark Museum, of course. And the management of the museum in Breslau was briefly taken over by Professor Karl Hasse, and later from 1907 by Professor Hermann Klaatsch, who had just returned from a trip to Australia, of course, and from where he brought back ethnographic objects, but also photographic documentation and human remains, of course. In 1909, the Institute of Anthropology was created. Despite this, however, initially all research, work, and classes with students took place at the Anatomical Institute. You can see here the building of the Anatomical Institute, and there also the private collection of Klaatsch was kept. It is interesting to note that as early as 1911, Klaatsch postulated that separate treatment of anthropological and ethnographic institution was desired. Eventually, the Institute of Anthropology was given a seat in a villa at Tiergartenstraße 74, now is on Maria Skłodowska-Curie Street, and it is a rectorate of the Medical University. Here you can see the archival photo. The institute opened at this location on 4th July 1914. There's the first exhibition of ethnographic and anthropological collection was set up and opened to the public. So then it was a museum of 2 specialities. But by then, it had already changed the function, no longer being only for researchers, but also was open for the public. In 1960, Klaatsch died. His private collection was passed to the museum. After his death, the government considered closing the institute, but fortunately a replacement was found. After Klaatsch in 1980, Professor Theodor Mollison became the director of the Anthropological Institute and thus the custos of the collection for several years. In 1926, Mollison got a position in Munich, and just 2 years later, Professor Egon von Eichstätt became the new director. A very important date for our research is the year 1932. This is when the separation of ethnography took place. It was a physical separation only, not a scientific one, since the management was still located in a villa of Tiergartenstrasse, at Tiergartenstrasse 74. So ethnography, however, obtained a separate institute in Breslau, which has its own budget, staff, and also a public museum with ethnographic collection. It was located in the seminary building at Martinstrasse 7. It's St. Martin Street today. And it's a very, very important moment since we're already dealing only with the ethnographic museum, so the separation took place. Instead, Eichstätt wanted to set up a museum of racial science and racial hygiene at the villa on Tiergartenstrasse, but he never succeeded. In 1941, the building was confiscated. I'm, of course, talking about the Villa Tiergartenstrasse. So it was confiscated and turned into a lazaret. And then the anthropological collection were moved to Martinstrasse. So here you can see the terrace houses at Martinstrasse, today St. Martin Street. We are not quite sure yet, but we think that the first building on the right, the one that was the building of Deutsche Institute, that was the place of the Ethnological Museum. Then in 1941, the anthropological collection were moved to Martinstrasse, to the rooms already occupied by the ethnological collection. And at that time, both exhibitions were made available to the public. In 1944, the objects were packed in crates and transported to the Botanical Institute building, so Botanische Anstalten, where they most likely never secured outside the city, waited out the war. It was a good decision because in 1945, the building of Martinistrasse was destroyed. The museum was not reactivated after the war, and most of the surviving collection was transferred in the 1950s to the today's National or State Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw. In Wrocław, only a little over 150 objects from the former collection remain in the collection of the University of Wrocław Museum. They now belong to the Department of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology of our university and are on deposit at the museum. Let's now talk about the current situation. For several years now, together with Dr. Urszula Bończuk-Dawidziuk from the University of Wrocław Museum, we have been conducting research on the said institution and its collection. We are both art historians, and this work, which has both historical and archival dimension, is aimed at restoring the place of this institution in the history of Wrocław museology and, above all, at restoring the memory of the non-European art and craft objects one brought to Breslau. We also want to start a discussion about them. We want our work to be summarized by an exhibition at the University of Wrocław Museum and by an accompanying catalogue. Preparing it is quite a challenge for us, After all, we are talking not only about researching a collection for object with a colonial past, but about researching a collection of object with a colonial past from a non-existent museum in a city that has only been Polish for almost 80 years. Objects that are not even be here anymore. Many complicated histories are connected here, but we are happily to observe the increasing openness to take up related topics. At this point, we would also like to express our gratitude for all the help and support we have received from the National Ethnographic Museum in Warsaw since the beginning of our work. This part of my speech is illustrated, not without reason, with photographs of the display case in which some of the aforementioned objects are currently on display at the University of Wrocław Museum. The photographs show the display case before and after intervention aimed at decolonization in the broader sense. I think yesterday you can heard something about this project of the museum intervention, as I could say. It announced the changes and at the same time includes everything that we would like to point out in our exhibition. So now, what we want to say about the exhibition we are planning. So the first point really important for us is to change of narrative. In our exhibition, in the exhibition we want to invite you in next year, we want to give voice to the objects. They are to be the main figures rather than just completing the biographies of successive professors and collectors, to whom priority is often given. How? By, among other things, using appropriate plaques with full information, emphasizing the subjectivity of the artist, of craftsman who made them. So here you can see, for example, the plaques from objects exhibited in the Mark Museum in Hamburg, where you can see information about the artist, the moment of the acquisition of this object, so the very important facts we can say about the non-European objects of non-European arts and crafts. The second thing is the broadening of perspective. I think today it can be openly stated that there is no such thing as an objective colonial era collection. It is always subjective, filtered through the taste of the collector. It was not uncommon for him to even indicate what he was interested in. And since there was a demand, there was also a supply. Sometimes the production of given objects of interest for the collectors increased. Sometimes those objects were even advertised by special post photo. One of them you can see here, for example. Today, having all this knowledge, we want to present the object from the University of Wrocław Museum in the broadest possible spectrum. Among other things, we want to move away from the dominance of male art, which is mean militaria, jewelry associated with warriors, etc., which also had been influenced over the years by aesthetic, like, for example, color, material, form, etc. So we talk about colonial thinking, I should say. We want to introduce more objects associated with women, for example, basket, mats, etc., which will highlight this aspect of non-European arts and crafts. And here again, you can see the fragment of the exhibition in Mark Museum in Hamburg. And you can see here the note about the problem that the field of ethnology was the man's field, and now we want to make some changes. And the third thing is the appropriate illustrative material. We all know what kind of materials and photographs were produced during the colonial period. You will not see them at the Planet exhibition or in the catalog. We do not want to duplicate so-called ethnographic materials, promoting harmful stereotypes, echoing brutality, and each time reducing the people depicted in the photographs to role of objects. This also means that all the photos planned for use will be subjected to careful analysis or, when required, discussion. And the 4 points, it's critical analysis of the collector's figures. We want to look at collectors or people who imported objects from the broadest possible perspective. Check their background and see what ambitions drove them. We are dealing here with a long list of donors and sellers, from those who were driven by scientific aspiration, like academics or travelers, to those whose direction of travel was imposed, like, for example, missionaries or military men, and those bringing souvenirs, like wealthy Silesian families. All of this can allow us to shed new light on the issue of collecting and to get to know the objects brought to Breslau even better. I think that these 4 guidelines I presented to you, and well, I have briefly outlined, are the most important determinants in our work. We hope that by following them, we will soon be able to present to you the result of our research in appropriate and respectful form. Thank you very much.